Homer was a legendary ancient Greek poet who wrote the epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These epics are part of the Western canon of literature and have greatly influenced the history of literature. The actual time and location of Homer's life is still controversial, as well as pretty much everything else about him. Any information that we have on Homer is speculation from scholars that now live more than 2,000 years after Homer. There is no reliable biographical information about the life of Homer. His historicity is still a question of debate. This is often called the Homeric question. His name meant hostage, and in some dialects was also referred to as blind, which led to the speculations that he was probably a hostage or a blind man. It is still unknown if he was born in the Ionian region of Asia Minor, at Smyrna, or on the island of Chios. The Homeric question concerns the doubts and the consequent debate over the identity of Homer, the authorship of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and historicity, especially of the Iliad. A few main subtopics of the Homeric question are: who is Homer? Are the epics of multiple or single authorship? By whom, when, where, and under what circumstances were the poems composed? How reliable is the tradition embodied in the Homeric poems? The lack of evidence today has caused the Homeric question to be difficult for one answer to be concrete. This has caused many different theories to arise about Homer, about who he actually was, about who actually wrote the epics, and also about the epics themselves. All of these theories have their own strengths and their own weaknesses, but none of them can be confirmed to be completely correct, so it is up to you as the reader to pick the theories that you like the best. Out of all the theories that are more popular can be summarized into a couple of lines. Homer's a blind poet who was born in X Greek city. Homer was a poet who used oral tradition. Homer had a personal writer who was in charge of transcribing the text dictated by Homer. Homer was just a collection of other bards over the course of early Greece, and that Homer was not a poet but instead a musician. The first of these theories is that Homer was a blind poet. This is largely based around his name, which I previously mentioned was the equivalent of blind. If Homer was indeed blind, that would suck. But the Greeks had a second meaning for the word blind. A blind man was believed to be more wise and more intelligent in order to make up for his lack of sight. It could be that Homer was called blind, like today we would say someone is a genius. Although the exact location of Homer's birthplace cannot be exactly pinpointed, scholars have narrowed it down to one of 7 cities, and the one that has the most claim to Homer is in Ionia, which at the time of Homer contained the dialect that the Iliad and the Odyssey were speculated to be written in. Also, the familiarity with that region that Homer incorporates within his text by saying where the wind came from only strengthens that Homer was from Ionia. Other theories suggest that the Homer we know today, who wrote the epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, may not have even existed, but a different Homer instead. A Homer who did not perform the Iliad or the Odyssey, but was the man who compiled it into the epics that they are today. It was generations of traveling poets who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, through oral tradition, retelling the story over and over again until they got it just right. This theory has a lot of standing within the text itself, and can be seen through the inaccuracies of the text. For example, a chunk of iron is given as a precious gift, much like our gold is precious today. But earlier in the epic, soldiers use iron arrows. You don't usually shoot precious metals from a bow. If this was written by the same Homer, the arrows should have been made from bronze and not iron. This theory is also supported by the language inside of the books of the epic. For example, books 1, 8, 11, and 22 are more harsh and more violent than the rest of the books, which leads us to suppose that the other books are written from a later time, one that is less harsh and more civilized than that of their predecessors. The idea that these books were written from different ages furthers the idea that Homer was many generations of bards following oral tradition. Another theory states that Homer was indeed the bard who authored both the Iliad and the Odyssey, but he was illiterate and had to have a separate scribe record everything that he said. Or, on the converse, that Homer was the scribe who recorded everything that the poet stated and put his own name on it. This theory, unlike most, has concrete historical evidence that supports it, unlike the other theories, which are largely based on the text alone. The theory that Homer had a scribe at first was immediately discounted because the first Greek alphabet adopted from the Phoenicians was not implemented until much after the proposed life of Homer. It was not until it was discovered that in the 12th century the Mycenaean scribes had an alphabet that would have been able to record Homer's epics, but it was so complicated that only a monk dedicated to the alphabet could have written it down. So Homer and the writer could not have been the same person. The next theory is that Homer was not a bard per se, or a storyteller for that matter, but he would have been more related to Bach or Mozart as a musician. This theory is less about who Homer actually was, though it focuses on explaining what Homer did. This means that the Iliad was not meant to be just a story, but as a musical production. This theory is a little bit different than the other theories because it contains evidence both in the text and through actual history. Repetition is one of the first things that supports this theory. If in a song you hear the melody in the chorus only once, it won't sound right to you, and you'll usually want to hear it again and again. So in this theory, the repetition is not used as a way to remember the stories. Instead, it's used as a musical element, much like Bach would use repetition in his music. It wasn't to help him remember his songs, but it was for the audience. The next evidence is a combination of meter and word choice. With the meter in the Iliad, it follows a consistent one long and then two short beats of equal length, creating something that is musical and that ancient Greek dancers could dance to. Combined with the meter, Homer would choose different dialects of Greek in order to achieve the correct meter and syllables and an overall musical quality. Of course, who is Homer is not always what is important. Even if we were able to answer that question with complete surety, it would likely not change anything. The Iliad would still be the Iliad, and the Odyssey would still be the Odyssey. So it's up to you to pick the theory that you like the best. But what is actually important is how Homer has influenced the world that we live in through the epics that he wrote. Homer's influence on the development of civilization cannot be overestimated. Many of the virtues presented in Homer's works, reason, intelligence, worldliness, secularism, courage, honor, integrity, and restraint, became pervasive throughout much of ancient Greek culture. The result was the birth of the fields of philosophy, science, history, drama, medicine, art, and much more. Advances the Homer's teachings through his writings defined who the Greeks were. Greeks looked to Homer's writings as a rule of thumb for how they wanted to live their lives. People of ancient Greece strived to carry traits represented throughout the famed epics. The monumental influence of Homer is nothing but undeniable. The depictions given by Homer could easily be labeled as the most important writings in Greek culture and are still used in modern schooling today. Although little about Homer can be known with certainty, his works have formed a foundation for all of the Western literature that has followed, and his characters and stories have had an impact on 3,000 years worth of readers. Facts about the poet's life can do little to add to that legacy. Legend says that as a child, Alexander the Great slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, and the fact that Alexander was neither the first nor the last boy to do so says more about Homer's genius than any biography. So for all the people that I have bored to sleep, here's all you should know about Homer. He is the oldest conspiracy theory, and that we really don't know anything about him. And anything that we do know is pure speculation. So what you need to remember about Homer is it's not so important whether he was a blind poet or a scribe or anything else, but what's important is the impact that he's had on the world, and more specifically Western civilization.